I'd like to welcome you to this installment of the DoD History Speaker Series. I welcome you on behalf of all the component history programs of DoD. We're going to be webcast, so if you have a badge on, if you please take that off and get that administrative note out of the way. And it's my great pleasure to very briefly welcome Bob Krick here as our speaker. He's an old friend, an all-around great guy, and most important for all of us today, he's a very highly regarded expert on the Civil War, and in particular, Stonewall Jackson. He grew up in California, but somehow fell in love with Civil War history. He spent over 4 decades working for the National Park Service on various eastern battlefields, the last 30 years or so as the chief historian at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania. He's a very prolific author on the Civil War, 20 books and more than 200 articles. And one of his books, Stonewall Jackson at Cedar Mountain, won the Douglas Southall Freeman Prize for Southern History. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, and we'll have time for questions at the end.
The topic today is chosen, as you might expect, because of the calendar. We are today 150 years, almost to the moment, after the end of Jackson's famous Valley Campaign. My assignment today, you'll be relieved to hear, is not to talk to you about tactics or strategy or operational things. We haven't time. You probably have an inclination to follow Jackson up and down the valley, but rather to look, in summary, at the unbelievable metamorphosis in Jackson's public image that was consequential upon this. And to open, I would give you a kind of a eccentric example, which I think is revealing and interesting, though, has to do with soap, the cleansing agent, soap. In April of 1862, before the Valley Campaign, Jackson, who had little reputation north or south, what reputation he did have was primarily for his eccentricities. No one would have paid him much mind north or south in April of 62. But just a few weeks later, at the beginning of the summer, a monthly periodical published in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the heart of Yankeedom, used Jackson to try to flog soap to Northerners, his enemies, to Yankees. Files OK Soap claimed in their printed ad that in the field, Stonewall Jackson nabs Files OK Soap and sighs for more. Well, the chances that Jackson even knew what Files OK Soap was were almost non-existent, but you by now at this point in your lives are mature enough to know how advertising people behave on these things. Today they would use some drug-befuddled television actor as their pitch man for whatever they're trying to sell. But here's Stonewall Jackson selling soap in the North. In a kind of an interesting footnote to that, this periodical in which the soap ad appeared was the American Phrenological Journal and Life Illustrated. Now, phrenology is not part of your day-to-day life anymore, but some of you probably know something about that. This was the fellow's rubbing his head. The science, or more aptly, the pseudoscience, that the bumps and the declivities, the ins and the outs on the top of your pate indicated your abilities or disabilities. It was very popular, widely credited in the middle of the 19th century. There were, if you ever look at a dictionary from the middle of the 19th century, you get to phrenology, there'd be a chart there with a drawing of a human head and 36 or maybe it was 38 different things that you could tell from that. One of them was tone, musical ability. Jackson was tone deaf, so he probably had a concavity there. Others had to do with conjugality and that sort of thing. Well, ironically, in that phrenological journal, here is Jackson flogging soap to Yankees in the middle of 1862. Before the campaign began, the epic Valley Campaign, he had no popular cachet whatsoever. His published mentions at that period, at the beginning of 1862, said very little about his military exploits. If they talked about him at all, they talked about how odd he was, how eccentric. And he was indeed. It's been exaggerated. Americans always do that with their heroes. They exaggerate the eccentricities and the anomalies and the unusual things. But there was a good bit of grist there too. But then starting on the 8th of May, 150 years and 5 weeks ago, on the 8th of May in 1862 at the Battle of McDowell, Jackson began surging up and down the valley, round and round, back and forth, and on the 8th and 9th of June, 150 years and a week ago today, he won twin victories at Cross Keys and Port Republic and was catapulted to wide fame nationally, not only in the South, but in the North, obviously, where they were selling soap with him. and across the ocean in England as well. He would soon have a companion on this quick trip to fame for Confederates in R.E. Lee, who by this point had no public image at all either. But the rise of the two men was decidedly different in speed, in timber. I once made the suggestion in writing, and it pleased me, I still use it, that Jackson's rise was sort of like the sound of calliope. Lee's was much calmer, better organized, like some sort of a pipe organ. Now, Jackson had been famous. Many of you know this. Most of you know this, I'm sure. Had been just a little bit famous, as a footnote, at the First Battle of Manassas, where he won what I suppose is about the most famous nom de guerre in American history, Stonewall, which resonates so well. There are others that might compete with it. John Hoffman, who's coordinating the series, has written a prize-winning biography of Chesty Puller, and Chesty resonates pretty well. But I would submit to you that Thomas Jackson was a bit fortunate in this nickname, Stonewall, because it sounds so good. It sounds powerful and tenacious. It sounds all of those things. What if instead he'd been one of the other Civil War generals with an odd nickname? Nathan G. Evans from South Carolina went to the military academy at West Point. His legs were so skinny that the fellow lads at the academy named him Shanks, and he was Shanks Evans for the rest of his life. Henry H. Walker from down my way, down the middle neck of Virginia. H. Walker came to be known as Mud Walker. Nobody's sure why. Adam Rankin Johnson, a Western theater general, was known as Stovepipe. Well, had Thomas Jackson been encumbered with one of those nicknames or something less euphonious, and had he captivated the entire known world like Alexander the Great, it just wouldn't sound quite the same. You wouldn't name a high school in West Virginia for him quite so readily if he were named Shanks Jackson, I suspect. But this was a long time ago, by the spring of 1862, the brief moment of kind of third-tier fame with the famous nickname at First Manassas had dwindled away because nothing happened in this theater for very nearly a year. The two commanding generals here, George B. McClellan for the United States and Joseph E. Johnston for the Confederate States, both had been configured by nature to be most comfortable doing nothing whatsoever. And they did that, both of them, unbelievably well, all through the rest of 61, the fall and winter of 61 and 2, the early spring of 1862. They did nothing. And the Sitzkrieg, as it would come to be known in a later century, in the Virginia theater, resulted in nobody accomplishing much of anything. Meanwhile, there was some activity and energy beyond the Appalachians, and all of the news was bad for Southerners and good for Northerners. There came word of the fall of Fort Henry, and then Fort Donelson, and then Shiloh. And in the Western theater, the United States waterborne might was wending its way southward. There's one of the great truths of the American Civil War. It's not part of my portfolio from Colonel Hoffman today, but I might mention to you, when you think about the Civil War, you might think about geography and whoever invented it and its impact on the war. In this theater, where we pay so much attention, included me primarily. I'm interested in what happened in Virginia. The Confederates, Lee and the rest, had all of the water courses most emphatically on their side. All of the water runs nominally from west to east, a series of moats in the way of a Northern army trying to impose its will on the South. The Rappahannock River for 2 years was a beautiful moat in front of Fortress Confederacy. The James itself, the Appomattox, the North Anna, Massaponax Creek, they ran in the way of the invasions. In the Western theater, they not only did not get in the way of invading Federals, they served the Federals beautifully because the water out there generally runs from north to south. And for the side that had everything that floated, that made corridors into the heart of the Confederacy instead of moats in the way. So there's a footnote for you. When Jackson went to the Valley in the November of 1861, having just the good new nickname but not a whole lot of experience, something I have found, which I don't think has been widely published, I'm sure it hasn't been, I think is kind of an interesting window into Jackson's notions. He wrote an order very early after he arrived, and he didn't stick with this notion long, but he called his headquarters of the Army of the Monongahela. You know how they named armies after rivers in that war? Army of the Monongahela. From Winchester, Virginia to the nearest shores of the Monongahela is a very long ways. But he was full of aggression and intention. He never got out that way, but I think it's interesting that he was looking that way. His first campaign fell afoul of the weather. This is the Romney campaign. And without the Weather Channel or anything remotely like it, he set off into the mountains of what is now West Virginia from Winchester on the first day of the year, New Year's Day of 1862, in beautiful, sunny, almost Indian summer weather, although it was January 1, and within about 12 hours, a ice storm had come in to be followed by a snowstorm, and the roads turned into packed ice, and it was just a terrible ordeal. I tell you about this and about the mutiny that resulted, not so much to give you chronological history, but to tell you something which seems to me fabulously illustrates the lack of standing that Jackson had at that point. The troops that were left out there in that ice after a couple of weeks of campaigning, while Jackson's original column went back to Winchester, did not like being out there. And in this citizen army, they did something which would be certainly going up the down staircase at the Pentagon. They didn't complain to Jackson. They did not complain to his military superior, Joseph E. Johnston, who was over in the environs of Manassas. He and Beauregard, that was the chain of command. They went round all of them outside the military channels to the Secretary of War, as it was still called in those days, and the President, Judah P. Benjamin, who was the temporary and horribly ill-fit Secretary of War, and Jefferson Davis, who was not much of a military leader either, at least in my view. They said, this Jackson is a nut, and he's got us out here where we don't want to be, and you must call us back in, override him. And the first that Jackson or his military superiors knew about this was when the Secretary of the War was saying, okay, you can come back in. Well, that's pretty much out of channels. Jackson resigned, understandably, was narrowly coaxed back into command by the governor of Virginia, who was a fellow townsman from Lexington, John Letcher, and that went away. But my point in all of this is, imagine that Jackson has been casually flipped aside by the bureaucrats in Richmond. Had someone felt eager to complain about Jackson 4 months later, by the June of 1862, after he had become the victor in the Valley, even the bureaucrats at the Wailing Walls in Richmond would have paid no attention whatsoever. No one was going to criticize Jackson then, but that they could criticize him casually and get away with it just before the campaign began, I think illustrates very nicely the extent to which Jackson had no standing at the beginning of 1862. The people who complained about him were old Army officers, the two general officers, William B. Tolliver and W.W. Loring, both of them querulous fellows of no particular capacity, although after the war they became Jackson admirers, trying to edge into the rosy glow surrounding him. He actually wrote things about him, but across the river from you here at the National Archives, there survives today the grumbling letter that went up, and that contains on it not just those two fellows who spent their whole lives grumbling. Even after the war, when one of them went to Egypt to command the army of Egypt, his correspondence is full of grumbles. That's W.W. Loring. But below that, it turns out, on the original document, are the signatures of each of the colonels or the senior field officer present in each of the regiments, all the way on down the line. And the first of the colonels to sign was a chap named Sam Fulkerson from Southwest Virginia, who was widely known to be Jackson's favorite colonel. And when Sam Fulkerson died, 16 days from now, 150 years ago, Jackson shed tears over that, and Jackson was not a demonstrative fellow. He obviously didn't know that Sam Fulkerson was near the head of the mutineers. But it would have been just unthinkable for any of those people to buck the legendary Stonewall Jackson, who had quite quickly become that. People looking back at the Valley Campaign, the citizens, the soldiers, the leaders, by the time it was over, everyone, of course, had recognized Jackson's genius from the beginning, hindsight being as impeccable as it is. I ran across, not so long ago, a woman who had an 85th birthday celebration in Paw Paw, which is now in West Virginia. You know where that is, up there above Harper's Ferry on the Potomac or near it? This old woman who was 85 they showed up to ask her what was the secret of longevity, and asked her what big things that happened in her life. She said one of the big moments in her life was when Stonewall Jackson, during the Valley Campaign, went by her door on horseback, and she went out and gave him a slice of fresh homemade bread, heavily buttered. Well, she wasn't remembering a hard-used frontier soldier. She was remembering a legend as she looked back, and Jackson became that during the Valley. Jackson's subordinates were decidedly unsure of him at the beginning of the campaign. They were, not a few of them, in the neighborhood of scornful. You've heard Turner Ashby's name, perhaps. Ashby was a dashing horseman, full of almost medieval notions. He had engaged in jousts before the war and knightly tournaments, and he was a great horseman, and the Valley boys liked to gallop around with him on a horse. He had no idea that by the middle of the 19th century, with rifled musketry and all of the other changes